These are the rolling fields of Picardy in northern France. It looks beautiful this evening, but it was once the scene of some of the most appalling carnage in military history. This is the epicenter of the Somme battlefield. The first day of the Battle of the Somme was the greatest British military disaster of the First World War. The village below us is La Boisselle, and on the 1st of July 1916, in the valleys to either side of it, 11,500 men became casualties. The highest concentration on the entire battlefield that dreadful day. We know a great deal about the killing fields of the Somme, but in fact there was another battlefield here, a private battlefield, and it lies beneath my feet. This is one of the great mysteries of the Somme, the hidden networks of tunnels that sleep beneath its villages and fields. Here, British tunnellers fought a brutal underground war, planting huge mines beneath the German front line. Mines were the original weapons of shock and awe. Their detonation at La Boisselle on the 1st of July 1916 should have signalled the beginning of the end of the war. To get under the German lines, tunnellers had to play a terrifying game of blindfold cat and mouse. To lose probably meant death. You never knew where the enemy was. He could be 40 metres away, he could be 40 centimetres away, but the more noise you made, the less likely you were to survive. But who were the men who fought in this subterranean battlefield? And why, in the end, did British High Command fail to press home the tactical advantage the tunnellers had given them? Well, now we've been given the opportunity to explore these tunnels, to find out what those men did. Their story is the last great secret of the Battle of the Somme. Whilst La Boisselle has now been rebuilt and the land returned to agriculture, this crater field, the physical legacy of war, is one of only a handful of untouched sites on the Somme today. An invitation from the family that owns the land provided us with a unique opportunity to investigate what happened to those who fought here, especially the tunnellers. It all started with a hole in the ground. It's quite tight here, but it's okay. I can see a long way down it. It is clear. This is the strange world on which the novel Birdsong was based. Until now, it could only be imagined. I'll just go a wee bit further. Okay. We know 1,000 men once worked here. Keep your belly flat to the ground. It opens out pretty quickly. You can see. Our first venture underground proved remarkable. You see to the end of the gallery. Above us, the evidence of the struggle has faded beneath the plough. There's candle burns here and there, but I think some of the wall are quite clearly peeled off. Yeah. Candle burns. But down here in the shadows we find a labyrinth, clearly intact, long hidden, still dangerous. Let's have a look. See if I can get down. A little bit tight just here. There's an air pipe here. Is the air pipe connected up? No, it's loose pieces. the most part, history has overlooked the tunnels' role, and their primitive war has remained mysterious. But we soon found evidence of their character. Oh, there's writing here. What? Graffiti? There's writing, yeah. Look, you can see the pick mark here of the man who's cut that out, and on this face, which has been cleft, is this extraordinary poem. I wish we could read the name of the author. If in this place you are detained, don't look around you all in vain, but cast your net and you will find that every cloud is silver lined. Still, look at that, still. Alex, those last 5 letters are really remarkable. Still, the word still, that speaks volumes, because the man who wrote this is right in the jaws of death. That every cloud is silver lined, still. Don't cry, there's a silver lining in the sky. Bonsoir, cheerio, goodbye. The village of La Boisselle lies on the Roman road from Bapaume to Albert, with the cities of western France beyond, an ancient axis of invasion. In the autumn of 1914, for the second time in 50 years, an invading German army marched down this hill, and it was here, at La Boisselle, that their progress was finally halted. This is one of the earliest maps produced of La Boisselle. It's a French one, and it shows us exactly what the village was like at the onset of positional warfare, at the onset of trench warfare. The Germans were driving through on this axis, pushing through the village, trying to take Albert and Amiens and then curve around to Paris. The French were coming in this direction, pushing up the same axis, and everything came to a stop just here. A contemporary German postcard depicts the fight for the village as a glorious triumph, but one eyewitness described it as hell on earth, which no living thing could survive. Such was the intensity of the fighting. Another recorded that no sign of life appeared over the surface of the ground. Even the grass was withered by the fumes of high explosive. Death, indeed, was emperor here. La Boisselle was a cauldron. The bitterest fighting was over the civilian cemetery, and for a farm on the western edge of the village, it stood here. This is all that's left of the courtyard. The remains of the farm is where the story of tunnelling at La Boisselle begins. This is all that remains of that farm. This is the Granatov, literally exploded farm, the name given to it by the Germans. The French called it the îlot. And the fighting over this farm was so bitter between the Breton troops, the French Bretons, and the Germans. Hundreds of people lost their lives fighting over a farmyard. Which way is he lying?
There's a chest here. Yeah. And probably one here.
So his head is over here?
Probably it's somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's lying in this direction?
Yeah. In fact, he's just like that with a hand. And probably, yeah, there's a rifle here.
This is his rifle?
Yeah.
Breton troops fought against heavy odds to hold back the enemy here. Their homeland and their pride was at stake.
The French will not withdraw behind the existing front line because they have bought that front line with the lives of hundreds of their men. And if that line was to be lost, if that line was to be given up, it would be a betrayal of that sacrifice.
After only 4.5 months of fighting, by Christmas, New Year 1915, the war descended into stalemate. These flags here, the yellow flags, they represent the French front lines, and the red ones, the German front line. You can see how close together they are. And what was about to take place was almost medieval. Trench against trench, static warfare, siege warfare. The trenches were fortifications on both sides. In between, you had no man's land. And that was the perfect environment for military mining. It was on Christmas Day, 1914, that French engineers sank their first shaft at this very point. And that was the beginning of a colossal struggle. The huge crater made by the German mine that obliterated the Granathof reveals the devastating nature of tunnel warfare. Whether they liked it or not, both sides were now locked in to subterranean conflict. There was nowhere to hide from a mine. It could destroy a trench and its occupants in an instant. For the infantry, even a suspicion that they were being undermined created a paranoia that quickly eroded morale. Within 12 months, no man's land was a chain of craters. And in fact, what happened was, as the explosive charges grew and grew in scale, the two opposing sides blew each other further apart. Tunnelling had long been a valuable tactic when enemy positions proved impregnable, or in the case of a castle or fortress, immovable. Military mining is as old as siege warfare itself. It would be a mistake to think that military mining and tunnelling was born in the First World War. In fact, it has a 4,000-year history. But there's only a handful of places on Earth where you can visit an early mine, and this is one of them. I'm on the east coast of Scotland, St Andrews Castle, and beneath us here is not only an offensive mine, but a counter mine, the defence coming down to meet the offence, and that is what mining and tunnelling in the First World War was all about. In 1546, a band of Protestant reformers and rebels were besieged here. When they detected noises suggesting the fort tower was being undermined, they themselves started digging to intercept the incoming offensive tunnel. You can see how the offensive tunnel just here is dipping very steeply down. That's to get underneath the ditch. The next target is that fort tower, and there they would have dug a chamber out and packed it with gunpowder. The reason why this place is so big is because they were using pack animals to remove the spoil, so donkeys or mules to carry it out up these steps. The steps are original, but of course at La Boisselle, those pack animals were the poor bloody infantry. But the key part of this system is just up ahead here. This is the essence of military mining. This is where the two tunnels met. The defence coming down here, having heard these guys tunnelling towards them to stop them undermining the fort tower, and the offence suddenly finding that they're face to face with the enemy. One of the strangest thoughts occurs to me, crawling through this place, is that you could take any one of the tunnellers who worked here, offence, defence, it doesn't matter, transport him 500 years into the future, put him in a First World War uniform, set him to work at La Boisselle, and within 5 minutes he would know exactly what to do. And that's because the methods for military mining did not change one jot in 500 years, because they simply didn't have to.
Throughout 1915, the French were losing men hand over fist, and the British were forced to take over, to relieve them on more and more sectors down the Western Front, Vimy, Arras, and eventually on the Somme. And it was at the end of July 1915 that the Black Watch arrived here at La Boisselle. And on this plan, we can see when the Black Watch arrive, these shafts are actually untenable. They're not deep enough, they're being blown apart by German mines, so they've had to step back to give themselves space to get underneath the Germans, to undermine the Germans. In trench warfare, if you're looking down upon your enemy, you had all the advantage. In tunnel warfare, you're better off underneath him. Schoon Street Trench, originally dug by the French, but they were all renamed by the Scots when they arrived in July 1915. And this was a main thoroughfare. This is the very first entrance ever dug by those men. The tunnels and trenches around Schoon Street, occupied by the Black Watch, are where we begin our deeper excavation. Morning all. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to our new arrivals. It's frankly been unbelievable what we've found, what we've learned. Every single minute we've been here has thrown up new information, which has been very, very surprising. We're working on the surface and we're working underground at the same time. We don't have any objectives because we don't know what we're going to find, so we cannot place any objectives. When you believe you know so much, you find something, you realise just how little you know. Really astonishing what we're finding. Hard to know what to say, isn't it? Imagine how easy it is to miss that. By the summer of 1915, the scale of operations at La Boisselle had dramatically increased. At Schoon Street, we uncover a prime ingredient of mine warfare: boxes of gun cotton explosive, and evidence of other materials vital to maintain huge armies on a static battlefield.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
What was that one? Petrol tin, probably a petrol tin, used for carrying water. When the armies came in here, the natural population just shot up from a few thousand to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men. There wasn't enough water for these men and all the horses and everything. So when the tunnelling started, they sank wells down through the water table in order to draw water from 110 feet down to serve the men in the trenches. So the tunnels serve three purposes: one, to defend your own trenches; two, to kill the enemy; three, to supply water. Without water you can't fight a war. So no water, no war. It didn't take the British long to bequeath fresh names at La Boisselle. The French îlot was rechristened the Glory Hole, a title that came to hold fearsome undertones for the soldiers who served there. This is what the sector looked like soon after the British arrived. The French tunnels they inherited were unconnected, low, narrow, airless, hazardous, and too shallow to be effective. Improving the situation required skills that the army did not have, until the arrival of a new kind of Royal Engineer unit, made up of professional tunnellers and miners, specially drafted in for their underground expertise. The tunnelling companies were the brainchild of one extraordinary man.
This manhole here in Manchester introduces one of the great characters of the tunnelling story, John Norton Griffiths. He was a millionaire, entrepreneur, engineer, and it was his men who were digging these sewers in 1913 beneath Manchester. When war was declared, Norton Griffiths Company was building an extension to Manchester's main drainage system. He relied on a unique breed of workers to dig through the clay geology of the area. They were known as clay kickers. Norton Griffiths called them his moles. It so happened that Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, was a family friend. Norton Griffiths wrote to him proposing that clay kickers might be very useful to the army.
Norton Griffiths, of course, wasn't suggesting to Kitchener that his moles should be digging huge sewer-like structures, as we saw beneath the streets of Manchester. No, what he was saying was that his men, his moles, could dig small, narrow, constricted tunnels, which would get underneath the German lines swiftly, but most important of all, silently. And none of the British military establishment believed that the war was going to extend beyond Christmas at that time, so the letter was simply filed under M for moles.
In December, the Germans blew the first mines beneath British positions. More and more followed. By mid-January, panic rippled through the trenches and the War Office.
Norton Griffiths was called in by Kitchener, and he demanded 10,000 clay kickers. There weren't that many in the country, but it put Norton Griffiths in charge.
There was no time for military niceties. On Thursday the 18th of February 1915, the first party of 20 kickers were told to leave these very sewers. Later that same day they arrived here at John Norton Griffiths' London offices, where they were attested and given a medical. The 18 that passed were immediately dispatched to Victoria Station for the next leg of their journey to an unknown destination.
The next stop was here, Brompton Barracks in Chatham, Kent, home of the Royal Engineers. So our 18 sewer drivers have arrived with no military training whatsoever to be inducted into one of the most illustrious corps in the British Army.
And these men couldn't salute, they couldn't march, they didn't know the difference between a bully beef and a brigadier, and that sent vibrations of nervousness through the corridors of power. The old and the bold didn't know how to treat these men. They were Royal Engineers now. 24 hours ago they'd been sewer drivers. Some of them could be trade unionists. Even worse than that, some of them could be Scottish trade unionists. But military training was of minimal importance. They were there to dig, to counter the escalating German underground threat. That very same evening, they travelled to France, and within 36 hours, Norton Griffiths had them tunnelling towards the enemy. His moles were now the most valuable commodity on the Western Front.
This is the clay kicking team. You've got the kicker here with his kicking iron, the bagger who's passing the lumps of clay back to the trammer, who will pass it to somebody else and they'll take it out of the system. Everything is being done in silence. The kicking is done in silence. It's not really a kick, it's a push. And that's absolutely deliberate. Once they've taken out 9 inches, they put another set of timber in. So what you're doing is you're moving towards the enemy 9 inches at a time, 9 inches at a time, 9 inches at a time, all the way to Berlin almost. The men are working in silence. They're working in very bad air. The rule was if a candle would burn, the air was good enough to work, and if it went out, you left the tunnel because there wasn't enough oxygen. And they're also searching for the enemy.
The prime duty of the tunnellers was not offensive, but defensive, to protect the infantry in the trenches from being undermined. To do so, they had to intercept the Germans and turn their galleries into graves by blowing them in underground.
So what you had was listeners at the end of a tunnel like this. And the first things that were used were civilian listening kit. This is, stick your ear to it, it's for finding water leaks. So that's the only tool they had at the beginning of the war. If they didn't have that, they used this idea. Biscuit tin, fill it with water, and on the water surface, the vibrations of German tunnellers nearby would make that water ripple. Now in November 1915, Norton Griffiths arrived at La Boisselle with one of these, the geophone. And with it, you could pick up German tunnelling 100 feet away, and you could track them in chalk. You could pick them up 260 feet away, an extraordinary distance. And what that allowed you to do was to track their progress towards you. And if they didn't hear you first, you could choose the moment that you murdered them.
In play, once the decision to blow the enemy had been taken, a hole was silently drilled towards the source of the sound. The weapon was a steel tube packed with explosive, a terrestrial torpedo known as a camouflage. The gallery behind it was then tamped, tightly backfilled with sandbags to maximize the explosive force.
What this conflict has, which no other part of the war has, is the ultimate form of barbarism. You wait before you blow until you know the maximum number of enemy are at the end of that gallery. You blow them in, it doesn't matter whether they live or die, it doesn't matter to you. But then if you're very clever, you've got another charge ready. And the one thing you do know is that miners will make the maximum effort to save their comrades. So you wait for the rescue team to come down, wait till they're digging, and then blow them as well.
In this deadly game, the challenge was to hear and kill the enemy before he heard and killed you. A race to the death.
When you're digging at home, you're digging for totally different reasons than what you're digging for out here. This seems to mean so much more. The rewards are far greater. They mean something to the men that are out here all the time. You know, they've never gone home.
Norton Griffiths knew that in sectors like La Boisselle, where tunnels were driven through chalk, the harder geology demanded different skills. So he began to recruit coal miners.
Norton Griffiths tours collieries asking for men to come forward, and the men who by and large enlist are those who have tried to join the infantry and have been rejected. So men who are too old, men in their late 30s into their 40s, and many of them lie about their age. The age limit is relaxed, so they'll take men up to 45, but there are men even over 45 who are coming forward. But the point is that these men are the elite miners. They have decades of experience. Some have been underground since the age of 14 or even younger for the oldest men. And they are highly skilled. They are the aristocracy of the coal mines.
Tunnelling at La Boisselle now entered a period of intense expansion. It was complex and technical, and required the guidance of an experienced civilian mining engineer. Norton Griffiths insisted he knew the man for the job.
Norton Griffiths wrote in his report to the engineer-in-chief that 179 Company needed a good, strong man. And that man that he had in mind was a mining engineer named Henry Hance. Now, Hance was described as a first-class rascal. But Hance was utterly focused, and it has to be said, utterly ruthless in achieving the objectives. The tunnellers had a traditional way of letting off steam. They were often very fond of drink, and in fact drunkenness was a continual problem that affected the efficiency of the tunnelling companies. Something that really illustrates the ruthlessness of Henry Hance was that where the tunnellers were living, there was a boarded up cellar which was full of wine and brandy. And one day Hance discovered that the tunnellers who were living in a cellar on the other side of the road to the wine cellar had started a tunnel to try to get to it. And he went in there with his sergeant major and another officer, and between them they smashed every barrel and every bottle in that cellar.
Hance was a hard man, but our excavations show he directed some great feats of engineering. 4 days of digging exposes a gallery marked on military maps as W at it. It descends to a depth of 10 metres and contains the remains of a tramway employed to shift the vast tonnage of spoil being lifted day and night from the deeps below.
This is W added, cleaned by our archaeologists. Look at the job they've done. This is the original floor. The gallery's in brilliant condition, but when you look at the walls, 2 of the candle marks are all still there. This was lit by candlelight, of course, but what they've revealed on the floor is absolutely astonishing. And this is miners' work. Here we've got the original sleepers for the railway. We've got the original runners for the railway. On top of those would have been 2 little steel rails to run a little wagon from the shaft behind me up to the surface. But most remarkable of all is because this thing was not mechanised, it was pushed by hand. The tunnellers needed a little bit of help for that, and here it is. Those holes have been cut by those tunnellers to put their feet in order to help them push this heavily loaded wagon up this slope to the surface. So I'm walking in the very footsteps of those men. Even the angle is correct, so they can push like a sprinter taking off from the blocks. There is nowhere on the Western Front where you can do this except in these tunnels. I'm in the footsteps of those men.
The end of W added is W shaft, the gateway to a deeper system, the fighting levels beneath no man's land. At first glance, prospects look good for a descent.
Doing here is using a mini high-definition digital camera and lowering it down. There are tunnels going off in that direction and in this direction from this shaft. There were tunnellers at the end of listening posts, listening for the Germans, and men were working below, infantry were working below, helping the tunnellers. It's very peculiar sitting here knowing what the history of this one hole in the ground is.
By November 1915, Hance's men had dug to 25 metres, and now began driving their first deep galleries out towards the Germans. From the right-hand gallery, Hance's listeners
Hans himself came in, and he listened there for 6 hours, and he decided they had to blow, so he ordered a chamber to be dug to hold 6,000 pounds of ammonite to destroy the German system. That was completed at midnight on November the 21st, 1915. At 1:30 the following night, the Germans themselves blew, and it took his charge with their own explosion, a massive blast. It was so powerful that the shock came right up the shaft, out of the galleries, and collapsed one of the entrances. The rescue party came down and they brought canaries with them in cages. They lowered a canary down to the bottom of the shaft and brought it back up 2 minutes later dead. They tried that again and exactly the same thing happened. So a man went down in breathing gear and he found at the bottom of this very shaft, which we're looking down now, 2 men dead, gassed, carbon monoxide gas. Using the remains of the winch, which is over there in the corner, they lifted their bodies up the shaft and carried them out. The 2 men remained trapped. John Lane, 45, and Ezekiel Parks, 37, both coal miners from Tipton in the Black Country. Parks and Lane are just 2 of over 120 British and French tunnellers who died at the Glory Hole. They were simply recorded as killed in action. Perhaps mercifully, families had no inkling of the character of their war or the nature of their death. Yet such events could not be a deterrent. Work went on. We believe the shaft can give us access to 3 kilometres of tunnels and a further, even deeper level. We've now cleared the shaft chamber. This is the original shaft chamber. And what we're actually doing is replacing what the tunnellers put in 1915 in timber. You can still see their original timbers. We're replacing that with steel. What we're going to do is build a steel cage here to protect us from anything that might fall from the roof. We'll also use the cage in order to brace this roof, because there's some very severe fractures you can see in the rock here. And so the most hazardous part of our exploration begins. Over 100 mines shook this chamber from below. Countless thousands of shells burst above it. For a safe descent, we need not only a team with many a specialist skill, but a structure that will support the technical equipment, winches, pumps, cables and ropes. As the Somme summer turns to winter, we secure the shaft and make it safe to descend. All being well, we plan to be the first people for almost a century to explore the lower levels of the Glory Hole. It's almost a journey into the Valley of the Kings for us, isn't it? Right. Okay. For us, as for the tunnellers at the time, the danger from gas is real. Carbon monoxide produced by underground explosions killed as many men as the blasts themselves. Colourless, odourless and lethal, pockets of it may still exist.
Picked up legs in front.
We may also have other gases to deal with, and low oxygen levels. For these are tunnels that haven't been open to the air for many decades. As a precaution, our team have gone through training with equipment made by the same company that manufactured the apparatus supplied to the tunnellers of the Great War.
That's it.
There's a very strong breeze coming through the hole. Clean now. We are through. Well done.
The air is clear, the shaft stable. Debris still blocks access to the lower levels, but we are able to clear a small hole for a first brief glimpse.
Yes, you can see the gallery going away to the left.
Yeah.
In fact, I think I can see the remainder of wooden railway line.
The gas detector has just slid away into another department. Alright?
Yeah. Just pull some knot on your back. That's it. Just move it there, that's better. Nice and steady, quick. Nice and steady.
It's very tight.
Well, you feel
Very tight.
that's enough.
It's through there, that's it.
Is it open up, Pete?
These railway lines. It's tiny. And it just feels primeval. Primitive. Which is precisely what this room was.
I'll take a photograph.
Here, finally, are La Boisselle's 25-metre fighting tunnels. They give us entry to 11 more shafts that descend to the deepest level near the water table. Just a few metres from the foot of W shaft is the end of the gallery in which John Lane and Ezekiel Parks were working on the night of the 22nd of November 1915.
And just up ahead here is a place I've been rather nervous of seeing. Here is the blocked gallery where Ezekiel Parks and John Lane still lie. It's a grave. But then we need to pay our respects to the first people down here in 95, 97 years. They need to know we're here. And they need to know that we know that they are still here.
In early 1916, plans were laid for a major summer offensive on the Somme. It was to present Hanse's tunnellers with their greatest challenge of the war. Instead of simply offering protection, they were now to play a key role in spearheading the attempt to break 2 years of stalemate. The French had thrown themselves at the German bulwark. They'd lost hundreds of thousands of men and gained nothing at all. And come 1916, with the Battle of Verdun going on, which was designed to bleed France white. That was the German goal, to bleed France white and force a political solution. Then came the turn of the British. In Picardy, on the Somme, with French help, they were going to break this barrier and force open warfare, slash the Western Front. And that is where La Boisselle came in, because this was in the epicentre of that planned battlefield. The Albert Bapaume Road was the main axis of Allied attack for this great Battle of the Somme. The village was German property. It was impossible to attack it frontally because of the crater field and because it was bristling with weapons. So the plan was to obliterate the German front lines either side of it with artillery. The tunnellers' job was to plant 2 huge mines on either flank. On this side, Weissap, and on the far side, Loch de Garde. That would blow a hole in the German defences which they could not defend, and through those 2 holes would swarm the infantry. Both mines were 179 Tunnelling Company's responsibility.
120-metre YSAP tunnel was driven from the deep level near the cemetery. Its purpose? To eliminate a multiple machine gun position on the north flank of the village. Mining efforts at the Glory Hole were redoubled in the months leading up to the attack. As the tunnellers inched their way towards the objectives, anticipation was mixed with fear. Were they about to deliver a knockout blow, or would the Germans hear them and blow them up first?
Timber being cut into the side wall here, just to give them a little bit of extra protection. Try to imagine, which we can't of course, a German blow taking place near here. This wall would simply crush you against that wall with the force of it. You can see the ground has been shattered. That's from German and British mine blows. Shattered ground. But it's still holding up. What would you do in a place like this if there's an emergency? If the Germans blew a mine? And all those men, there were 900 people working underground here. How on earth would you reach the shaft? What a scramble that would be. Oh, the horror of it. I found the other shaft chamber here, it's just on my left hand side. You might be able to hear the echo. It's perfectly cut, as you would expect. And that goes further on. It goes on and on and on. I can't see the end of the gallery. And off it are the listening posts and the mine chambers, off in the direction of the enemy, in an easterly direction.
Laying a mine isn't just about digging tunnels. It involves the excavation of underground caverns, mine chambers, to house the explosive charge. Once filled, the gallery behind was packed with sandbags of chalk to force the blast vertically.
This is the entrance to a mine chamber. There's a tunnel going out under no man's land, because we are under no man's land here. And it goes forward in zigzags, and there's a chamber at the end of it. This bit has been blocked up, probably just backfill, and I can see beyond. But I've just seen something very, very thought-provoking indeed, because down here are the cables from the mine. They've been cut, fortunately. But what we don't know, of course, is whether there's still a mine in there. What a very strange thought.
By early summer, excellent progress had been made. But now the galleries had to pass beneath a belt of suspected German listening posts. A new approach was required.
There were times when you were mining where there was no choice but to work with noise. However, when it came to the big mines which were being prepared for the beginning of the battle, Lochnagar and Wysap, everything had to change when they reached a certain point. The pick was put down in favour of the bayonet. It was a little bit like a clay kicking team, in fact. One man with the point of his bayonet just easing out a lump of chalk, the second man catching it, but the third man was an officer, and his job was to make sure that those first two worked in the maximum amount of silence.
High Command finally selected the 29th of June as the day of the attack, to be preceded by the greatest artillery onslaught in history. But completing Lochnagar by bayonet alone proved impossible. The tunnel was stopped short, and two huge chambers dug to hold 60,000 pounds of explosive. By far the biggest British charge of the war to date. The preliminary bombardment began on the 24th of June. Over the next
next week, a torrent of 1.7 million shells descended upon the Germans. The countdown, the tunneller's moment of glory, was underway.
Hans had charged his men to plant 20 tons of explosives beneath the Weissach, 30 tons beneath Loch Nagar, and 2 enormous charges under the glory hole itself to destroy the German tunnel system. The bombardment was falling, time was running out. There was no more tension than at this moment. Through these fields were lines and lines of infantrymen carrying tins of ammonal explosive up to the mines, up to the chambers, to charge them ready for the 1st of July. Nerves were at breaking point. Even 100 years later, these frontline German trenches are still 2 metres and more deep. This is what the British had to contend with. Henry Hans had an idea for this. He wanted to blow Weissach early, several days early, so it would wipe out the German machine gun positions and also shorten the distance that the British troops would have to attack across no man's land.
The resulting crater, he said, could then be occupied and employed to dig an advanced jumping-off trench for the British infantry. A trench that would effectively reduce the distance across no man's land by over 150 metres.
What Henry Hans was trying to achieve by blowing up Weissach early was to cut out the German chance of enfilade. And that means firing the machine guns up no man's land, along no man's land, at about knee height. If you just train your machine gun and fired it, it meant that the British troops crossing this way would have to walk through a stream of bullets, and they would be cut off at the legs. And when we talk about men being cut down like a scythe, that's what happened with machine guns. They were just cut down here and fall to the ground.
Hans's corps commander agreed that neutralising enemy fire from the flanks would save lives around La Boisselle. But the explosion would warn the enemy an infantry attack was imminent, so the answer was no. As the big day drew close, the attack was delayed. British commanders were most anxious that the actual moment of assault, now set for 7:30 a.m. on the 1st of July, should not be compromised. But it was compromised, and it happened here at La Boisselle.
Mine chamber, an uncharged mine chamber, but also listening post.
What the British were not aware of until after the battle is something rather serious, in fact possibly the most serious, but little thought of fact. And that was that in one of the German tunnels there was a chamber within which was a machine called the Moritz system. And it was specially designed to pick up electrical impulses passing through the earth itself, telephone impulses. And somebody on the British side on the night of the 30th of June sent a telephone message unscrambled to one of the brigades holding the line here, and it said, "Good luck tomorrow morning." The only thing the Germans did not know after 8 days of bombardment was the moment of the British attack, and the British had just told them. The 1st of July was a clear, warm day, but the air trembled with the thunder of artillery. The infantry were poised to go into action, all mines charged and exploders connected. After months of toil, the tunnellers were prepared and ready for their moment. These trenches filled with infantry. They knew nothing at all of what was going on beneath their feet. They were not allowed to know that, because if they'd been captured with that information, it could have led to the loss of those mines. The tunnellers were ready to push the plunger down. That was their moment of no return. For the infantry, however, it was this sound. That, when they knew they were going over the top. 7:28, 2 minutes to 0. The scale of the eruptions was most dramatically seen from the sky. Aerial observer Cecil Lewis had a unique view.
There was an ear-splitting roar, drowning all the guns, flinging the machine sideways in the repercussing air. The earthly column rose, higher and higher to almost 4,000 feet. There it hung or seemed to hang for a moment in the air, like the silhouette of some great cypress tree.
This is the extraordinary result of 30 tons, 60,000 pounds of explosive. Everything in the path of this crater would have been simply obliterated. And finally, the shock wave from this massive explosion passed through the German dugout, through the soldiers themselves, hemorrhaging their brains. Two minutes later, troops from the Tyneside Scottish and Tyneside Irish rose to assault enemy trenches that lay smoking and pulverised before them. But something wasn't right. In Mash Valley, next to the huge Weissap crater, the leading waves were seen to wither and fall before they had gone 100 metres. The Germans had heard British tunneling, evacuated Weissap, installed their machine guns elsewhere, and throughout no man's land produced a lethal hail of enfilade crossfire. Hance's worst nightmare had come true. The Germans were not neutralised, and that's because the Germans were in dugouts, deep shelters underneath the trenches. They'd taken their weapons down there. The moment the bombardment stopped or moved on, up they came out of the dugouts, placed their machine guns on the parapets, and cut down the British soldiers like corn. They were scythed down like corn. 5,100 men lay in this valley before noon on the 1st of July. On the other side of the village in Sausage Valley, where Loch Nagar was blown, over 6,000 men were dead, wounded and missing. The killing fields astride the glory hole saw the highest concentration of casualties on the entire Somme battleground that day, the most disastrous in British military history. La Boisselle was meant to have fallen within 20 minutes. That night it was still in German hands. Their 2-year occupation had allowed them to create a bastion with hundreds of deep shelters that withstood the pummeling of even the heaviest British guns. And so the tunnellers had achieved everything and nothing. The fact that it did not help the infantry was not their fault. British High Command had put their faith in the guns. That was their major weapon in their armoury. But the Germans knew that. They were prepared. And they put themselves underground, out of harm's way. So, at La Boisselle, the tunnellers did everything in their power to assist the infantry to succeed. But it was never going to be enough. What happened on the 1st of July exposed the limitations of mine warfare. It can deliver destruction, shock and awe on a grand scale, but only momentarily. When La Boisselle finally fell to the British on the 4th of July, the glory hole became immediately redundant, abandoned as the front line crept forward. No tunneler can keep up with a moving army.
Along the old Roman road, the battle continued until mid-November, claiming a further 1 million casualties for 6 miles of bludgeoned terrain. Today, agriculture shares the fields and pastures of the Somme with monuments to the fallen. Little survives of the surface war, but beneath lies the kingdom of the tunnellers. The world they made at such great cost, and where so many remain entombed, is all still there. This is their monument.